thank you for joining us. I am Audra Montenegro with O'Reilly Media and will be your host for today's webcast. Today we have Whitney Quisenberry, and she is going to talk to you about accessibility as a design challenge. Whitney Quisenberry combines a fascination with people and an obsession to communicate clearly with her goal of bringing user research insights to designing products where people matter. She's written 3 books: Storytelling for User Experience, Crafting Stories for Better Design and Global UX, Design and Research in a Connected World to help practitioners keep users in mind throughout the creative process, and her latest book, A Web for Everyone, Designing Accessible User Experiences, is a collaboration with Sarah Horton. She's also passionate about civic design and runs the Center for Civic Design with Dana Chisnell, where they aim to improve the usability and design of ballots and everything else about elections. They work with election officials, conduct research, and publish the field guides to ensuring voter intent. Before she was seduced by a little beige computer into software, usability, and interface design, Whitney was a theatrical lighting designer on and off Broadway, learning about storytelling from some of the masters. All right, folks, as we get our webcast started, I would like to go over some housekeeping tips to get the most out of today's event. First, you'll want to open the group chat widget if you haven't already done so. This is where we will interact with each other during the event and where you will submit your questions for Whitney. We find that our audience usually has a lot of good knowledge to share, so we encourage you to chat freely during the event. However, if you have questions for Whitney, please be sure to preface them with a capital letter Q so we know that it is for her and we can make sure she sees it for Q&A. You can also open, move, and resize any of the other widgets. If you would like to tweet from the Twitter widget, you may need to give it permission to access your account. Our hashtag today is AUX, and the Twitter widget will automatically append that to your tweet so you don't have to. If you have any problems during the event, we encourage you to look at the help widget, which is very thorough. And if you continue to have problems, post in the chat room so one of our staff can help you. For choppy audio or stalled visuals, please try refreshing your window first. And remember that the best thing you can do for a good audio stream is closing any apps that could be interfering. So because people always ask, we would like you to know that we are recording today's webcast and will have an archive available usually within 48 hours. All right, and folks, at this time it is my pleasure to turn the program over to Whitney for her presentation. Hello, Whitney.
Hi. Really glad to be with you today. It's great watching how many places around the world we're all from, and for those of you in nice, sunny, warm places, please don't tell us about it. You're all sitting, half of us are sitting in the snow. So what we're going to talk about today is accessibility, but I hope I'll be able to talk about it to you in a slightly new way. When most people think about accessibility, certainly the way I was introduced to accessibility, it's a technical challenge. It's about meeting code requirements and filling out checklists and matching standards and laws depending on what country you're in. But that's not a very satisfactory way to think about how we design. What we tend to do is design first and then kind of layer accessibility on. And I'd love to get us all to think about a new way of thinking about it, which is that what we're doing is trying to bring all the awesome apps and awesome websites and wonderful goodness that we're creating and design and create them in a way that everyone can use them. So one other apology, I have a slight cold and may have to take a little cough or water break in the middle of it. I will try not to cough directly into the microphone. Also another one, if someone needs captioning, we have live cart running. Just put it in the chat window and they'll text back the URL to you. In fact, maybe we should do that now, Audra, just to make sure, since if you need cart, you may not be able to hear what I'm saying.
Yes, I'll go ahead and push it out right now.
Thanks. So just to get us started thinking about what we mean when we talk about accessibility, I've got 4 pictures on the screen which I'll describe, but I'd like you to be thinking about, as I do, which of these are just for people with disabilities. So we have a pair of eyeglasses, a keyboard with a microphone on it, some kitchen tools, and a postal card. Eyeglasses seem pretty obvious. They're about, improving your eyesight so that you can function normally in the world. I certainly wear pretty heavy glasses. The thing that's interesting about eyeglasses is that even when I was young, they were pretty ugly. They were black kind of medical devices that you wore with very thick lenses. They were heavy, they were uncomfortable, and we got teased about them. Glasses have actually changed. They're now a fashion statement. They can be beautiful. They can be tied to your wardrobe. They can reflect your personality. And they're now no longer just a medical device. They're part of how we express ourselves. The text-to-speech on the keyboard, or actually speech-to-text, so you can do speech input. Much of the text-to-speech and speech-to-text research actually started out in disability research, but now it's become mainstream. The keyboard here happens to be an Android keyboard, but the same features are available on iOS and probably most of the other platforms because we've integrated that technology into everyday devices. And I'll talk a little bit later about why that's so important. The kitchen tools shown happen to be from the OXO Good Grips line. They're nice kitchen tools, but most importantly, they were designed for people who had trouble gripping or holding small objects. So they have big, squishy handles that make them actually very comfortable for everyone. And when you go to buy them in the store, they're not in a special section that says, for people with disabilities, here's something to buy. They're just in the kitchen tools section, just like everyone else. The postal cart was actually invented. It's a United States postal cart when women wanted to be postal carriers. And there was some worry that they would not be able to carry the large packages and large backpacks of mail that postmen had to carry. And they were told they couldn't be a postman until someone figured out that if we put those big sacks of mail on wheels, that not only could women do it, but that it removed part of the strength requirement and made it possible for many, many more people to have this job. And that's part of what we're really looking for, is how can we do something in all of these cases so that features that help people and help adapt, help people with a wider range of capabilities use the product or the service or the website or the web app. How can we make that part of just how the thing works instead of something special? There is an international standard called the International Classification of Functioning from the World Health Organization. Until the late 20th century, disability was defined in medical terms. It was defined as the functioning of a part of the body. But there was a change, and disability is now defined as the outcome of an interaction between a person and the environment or the attitudinal barriers they may face. So that means that disability isn't about the person, and it's not about the thing. It's about the interaction between those two things. When I first heard this, I got really excited because, like many people, I think I thought accessibility was a good thing. We should all do it, but I didn't know what I could do in my work as a user researcher. I didn't know how I could contribute to that. But when we define disability as the result of an interaction, well, we are interaction designers. We design user experience. We create those things. And so now all of a sudden, I can do something about it. So every time I think about a tiny little change, putting a description on an image, or just some small change that makes it more possible for more people to use what I create, that removes those barriers, then I've done my little part that day for helping make the world more accessible. Stuart Brand, author of The Clock of the Long Now and many other interesting books, came up with a concept that he called pace layering. And the concept is that things move at different paces. If you think about an oval-shaped track or a circular track, something on the outside of that track moves very quickly in comparison to something on the inside of that track, just like an orbit. And so he drew a layer that has nature in the middle, moving very slowly, changing very slowly. The next layer out in his model of pace layering is culture, then governance, then infrastructure, then commerce, and then in the outer ring, moving very, very, very fast, is fashion. And the concept that he was thinking about was that things move, because things move at different paces, when they get out of sync, if fashion starts to move too fast, it outpaces culture. If commerce moves too slowly, it can't keep up with fashion, and so on. And we can think about this same concept, but apply it to accessibility. So on the outside, we have technology, which these days is certainly moving very, very quickly. New products being introduced, new things changing all the time. The next ring might be our habits, right? Both our habits of how we use the web and our habits of how we create the web. And we can change those. Habits can change sometimes seemingly overnight when something new is adopted. This next slower layer is work process. Because that involves coordinating between people, it changes a little more slowly. And so we have to give it time to catch up, or we have to make sure that we work on making sure that it stays up, so that the way we as teams create things can keep up with the new technologies. I put attitudes next because I think attitudes are kind of like culture. They're kind of core beliefs about what we do and why we do it, and they change even more slowly. Below that, we have laws, standards, and regulations. I was on the Section 508 Refresh Committee, and we finished our work in about 2007, 2006, and we're still waiting for that standard to be updated as it goes through a slow regulatory process. So standards take longer, laws take even longer, and I've left nature alone because I don't think anything we do is really changing nature. But when we think about this, we can see why it's easy for accessibility of products to get out of sync. If we think about the pace of technology adoption, the telephone was introduced in 1876. And then we had a long kind of stable period, at least in terms of communication technologies, until about the 80s when we started getting the fax machine, the Apple I, IBM PCs, and Walkman. And then starting in the 90s, it all started getting fast. JAWS, the screen reader, was introduced in the early 90s. Macintosh, email, Google, BlackBerry, and it all starts cascading very quickly until it seems as though, month by month things change. There's a picture on the screen of a woman named Glenda Watson Hyatt, who's one of my heroes. She writes a blog called the Do It Myself blog, in which one of the things she says is that she's written 3 books with just her left thumb because she has cerebral palsy and doesn't communicate well verbally. She says, I feel like technology is finally catching up with what I truly need. Right? That we're finally getting to the point where technology can give her the tools she needs to not have to rely on specialized technology and to participate in daily life. So I think about her often and how full and rich a life she and everyone else can have. I love the technology I work on. I bet you guys do also love the technology you work on. Why wouldn't we want everyone to be able to use it? So as I think about what we do, I think they're kind of steps. The first step is it accessible, right? Have we gotten rid of the basic barriers? We can then think about whether it's usable. That is, have we made it into a good user experience? And then we need to think about whether it's actually being used and make sure that we're not creating things that are in kind of little ghettos that might be wonderful, but nobody knows about them and nothing happens. There are 2 pictures on the screen to illustrate this. One on the left is a sign that says, has the international symbol of someone in a wheelchair, and it says ring bell for voting assistance. This is probably at a polling place where there are steps to get into the polling place. And so as opposed to being able to just come into the polling place like everyone else, they ring a bell and a poll worker brings the ballot out to the curb for them. Now, this is nominally accessible, right? It's better than not being able to vote at all, but it's not as good as having a fully accessible polling place. This other picture shows 3 voting booths in a row. 2 are set up on stands where you can stand, and 1 is sitting on a table where someone who either needs to sit down to work comfortably or perhaps is in a wheelchair, can use that voting machine, and they're all three in an equal row. And I think that's what we're aiming at. Even if there are differences in how we interact, that those differences are presented in an equitable way, and that they are easy for someone to make the choice of which one to use at the moment they need it. So, thinking about all of this, when Sarah and I thought about how to organize the book, we thought about organizing it around the way we think about user experience in general, and we call them the principles for accessible UX. There's actually 10 of them. I'll tell you about the 10th in a minute. But the 9 are people first, clear purpose, solid structure, easy interaction, helpful wayfinding, clean presentation, plain language, accessible media, and universal usability. So it kind of works from the inner core of the product out to some of the features and then wraps back around to make sure that the whole thing has come together. So let's start with people first and think about what that might mean. Well, first of all, it means designing for differences. Anybody who does user research thinks a lot about differences in different kinds of people, differences and similarities in different people in the audience. And we start from the people we're designing for. We start from that audience. We want to think about their context. We want to think about their how, when, and where they're doing the task, what they're thinking about it, what their emotional connection is. So on the screen, I have 3 very quick little profiles. Imagine we're making, I don't know, some sort of app for, average young web users. We might have Emily, who's a high school graduate working on her college degree, lives with a group of friends, works part-time at a local community center. We might have Jacob, who's a college graduate taking legal training courses, working as a paralegal, where he writes case summaries. Also shares apartments with friends, and is a kind of, he's a big laptop and iPhone user. Stephen graduated from an art institute, works as a graphic artist in a small ad agency, and he's a little more even technology connected: iPad, iPhone, MacBook Pro, great monitor at work because of course he's a graphic artist. Maybe pretty typical people, but let's take one more step and think about what else might be behind those people. So Emily, who's modeled in part after Glenda Watson Hyatt, but also many other people I've worked with, has cerebral palsy. It's difficult for her to use her hands, and she has some difficulty speaking. She uses a motorized wheelchair. So all of a sudden we've layered on top of a basic college graduate who's working, college student who's working at a community center, we've layered on top of that an element of their capabilities and ability. We can then think about, is she a power computer user or not a power computer user? What kind of input devices does she use? And what's her attitude? Her basic attitude is that she wants to do everything for herself, and she can be a little impatient. Because she knows how good things can be, she gets impatient when they're not that good. She uses a communicator that has a speech generator. She has an iPad that's her main device because it turns out the gestures work well for her. And of course she has her power wheelchair. We might do the same thing with Jacob. Maybe Jacob is blind, has some light perception, but he's a really skilled technology user. Thinks of himself as a digital native. He's an early adopter. He's likely to hang in there until he gets it. Loves new tools and new gadgets. His basic computing technology is that he uses a screen reader to read the screen to him. He has an audio note-taker device, but he also uses a braille display both to read text and to take notes. And his basic attitude is that the right technology lets me do anything. So he's someone who, if you give him the tools he needs, he will be delighted. And Stephen, our graphic artist, might be deaf. His attitude is he thinks his only disability is that everyone else doesn't sign. He speaks American Sign Language, but he can also speak and reads lips. His big technologies are he likes to use texting for obvious reasons, like Skype because he can use video Skype and video chat. In fact, the picture shows him having a little video chat on his mobile phone. He's really good with graphic tools, likes visuals better, but his spelling isn't that great, so it makes text searching difficult for him. And he can be a little annoyed when people rely on video and don't have captions. Uses CART a lot, uses captions, and likes video chat. So you can see how you can take any description of a user and you can add an element of ability or disability to them. We've actually created 8 of them for the book. They are online and will be available to everybody. They range from Trevor, who's a high school student with autism, Maria, who's bilingual, Vishnu, who's not only bilingual but has low vision, Leah, who has fibromyalgia, so she gets tired easily and is fatigued, and Carol, who's a grandmother, in addition to the 3 you've already met. So just beginning to think about capabilities is the first step, thinking about not people with disability as a separate class, but as an overlay over all of the users, because we could have mixed them up anyway. We had to make some choices, and those are the choices we made. But we've attempted to think about how different kinds of technology people use and different capabilities that might affect the interaction design that we work on. So, moving on to the next principle, which is clear purpose. And clear purpose basically means that we have well-designed goals. Why is this important to accessibility? Well, it's the same reason it's important to any design. In 2009, Luke Wroblewski started talking about something he called mobile first. He said, maybe we should design for mobile first because mobile forces you to focus. In other words, the discipline of working on a tiny screen compared to a large laptop screen forces you to think about what's really important. What are you going to fill that first view with? What order are you going to present things in? How are you going to organize that? Accessibility also forces you to focus because it forces you to think not just about interaction for the small screen or design for the small screen, but variety of interactions for preferences. Right? Maybe I prefer using a keyboard. Maybe I need to use a keyboard. Maybe I am working in a situation where I'm not allowed to have a mouse. Medical software, for instance, you often don't want to have a mouse or certain kinds of pointing devices in an environment where there might be liquid or blood. Right? So again, thinking about the purpose of the application and the audience gives you a great starting point for any design, but it is especially helpful when thinking about designing for a broad range of people. I know we often say, let's start with a narrow audience and expand, but sometimes that means that things get left out. If we start designing for one screen and then try to layer other screens onto the design, maybe we haven't thought about it carefully enough. Similarly, if we just design for people like us, however we define us, or people like our target audience, but don't think about other audiences, it can be hard to expand the product later. So even if you're doing a minimal viable product and a lean rollout, you might want to have already thought a little bit about the breadth of where it needs to go to accommodate a large audience as the product goes. The next principle is solid structure and building to standards. The idea here is that when something is built to our technical standards, people can feel confident using it. This, I don't know, we probably all remember the browser wars and all the horrible, this site works best when seen in name a browser. This matters to accessibility because assistive technology, things like screen readers, are essentially an alternate browser, right? They're reading the source code and they're representing that information, displaying it in a medium appropriate for the needs of the person using that technology. So you have this layer of the operating system, the browser that's being used, and then the technology being used to interact with that browser, which might be a mouse and keyboard, but it might be a screen reader and keyboard. The pictures on the screen are 2 versions of the 2010 WordPress template. I know they have different pictures on them and slightly different words, but the one of them, the one on the left, is the base template, and the one on the right is the accessible template that Sylvia Eggers designed. And except, that they are indeed slightly different screens, but in terms of just looking at it as a design comp, there's really no difference between them. And that's because a lot of what happens under the cover is what makes accessibility happen, and that's why standards are so important. So two things are happening in the world that I think are kind of important. One is that a group of people like Accessible Joe at WordPress, Steve Faulkner, and many others at the W3C are beginning to say, let's not wait until the standard is formed and then add accessibility features. Let's get accessibility into the actual standard. I picked WordPress to show this because, sorry, I forget the number the second, but WordPress is the platform for a gigantic percentage of all the websites in the world. So if you start from an accessible template that's built to standards and is strong and well-structured and robust, then the site you build on top of that is more likely to be accessible. If you're just someone who wants to start a blog and you're just going to use an existing template and your focus is going to be on the content you put into that blog, we've restricted the number of different accessibility problems you can create, and we've made it easier by having good tools in that platform for what you do to also be the right thing to do. I just want to show you a quick example of what an unfriendly structure looks like. I blocked out the name of the site because, frankly, it doesn't matter. There's lots of them like that. It's a typical, magazine site with a ad at the top of the page and some featured articles and a menu, and then finally we get to the name of the author and an opening picture, and we go past a couple of ads, and then even below the picture where it is that I've shown on the screen, we get to the headline. That is the thing we actually came to read when we got that page. When I look at that page with keyboard only and just ticking through, going tab, tab, tab through the screen, it took 41 key presses just to get to the headline, because there are all the menu links and there's the ad links and all these things are going on, and it's a long way down. So that's a structure that's unfriendly, that doesn't help people quickly do the same thing in a linear interaction that we can do in a nonlinear interaction. So that's the kind of thing that we're trying to avoid by using a good structure and building to standards. A well-structured site, we'll talk about how the navigation on that page might have worked in a little bit, but would have given someone an option to say, I've entered the page to read this article. Let me just jump down and start reading that article right away. Okay. And I see that Mary has a question about investing time and energy in accessibility. I think this is the kind of thing that we always ask. I'm going to deal with this in a bit later because I think it is an important thing because as we saw in that pace layering, getting the team processes to work in sync with our goals is part of the challenge. But I want to think about all the things we're trying to ask the team to think about before we start thinking about how to make them think about it. So the next principle is making the interaction easy. When we think about mobile, we're thinking about how people use the product across a range of devices, like different kinds of tablets and phones and so on. When we think about accessibility, we're simply adding a broader range of devices because we're thinking about modes of interaction and some specialized devices. So, for example, you might be thinking about using the site with a Braille reader, or using the site with something that instead of a mouse has got two large buttons, or someone who has enlarged the text, say, 8 or 9 times. One of the lovely things about iOS and is developing in Android is that the screen readers and much of the accessibility features are built in. Many accessibility features are built into the operating systems that we use, even if they're not upfront and visible. But iOS went a step further and really moved the bar for us because they just said it's there all the time. You just turn it on and you can zoom the size of the text. You can have the text speak to you. You can change the mouse interaction or the tap interaction. And all of that is really important because not only does it provide a solid structure for us to build on. It provides a solid structure for users who need it. There are two other pictures I'd like to sort of call out and talk about in here. One in the lower right is Glenda Watson-Hyatt again, using her iPad. And one of the things I want to point out is that why it's so important that she's using an iPad specifically, I mean not specifically an iPad, but she's using a piece of regular everyday consumer hardware, is because so many of the tools that she needs that used to be separate and rather expensive pieces of hardware are now combined into a regular everyday piece of stuff that you can go down to your corner, down to the mall and buy. The other one is in the center. It's a picture of 3 screens with a hand on it. And this was something that T.V. Rahman at Google came up with. He was trying to deal with the question of how do you dial the phone when the phone is on a glass screen with no touch points, and you can't just feel where the buttons are. And he thought, what we've been thinking about is how do we get the finger to the button? But what if we did it the other way around and we brought the button to the finger? So wherever you touch the screen, that's 5. So if I want to dial 3, I move my finger up to the northeast. If I want to dial an 8, I move my finger down to the south and I lift it. So by thinking about which direction you move your finger, he's begun to combine the system responding to the person and gesture to be able to dial a phone on a glass keyboard. It's actually pretty cool, and I can do it quite fast. So when we think about features and accessibility features, we want to think about whether we've built it in or added it on. In the United States, especially on the East Coast, there's a train system called Amtrak, and they have ticket kiosks, as many people do, as many transportation systems do. And one of the things, it's a touchscreen kiosk with a keypad for numbers, but it also has an audio plug for speech, and it's got a specialized keypad just to the left of the regular keypad that lets you navigate the screen. So it's got an up, down, and the select and a help button. It's built in. It's just there. And one of the things I love about it is the number of people I know who think about accessibility and who have probably ridden Amtrak and have never noticed that. It's there when you need it. It's just waiting for you. The contrasting image is a Kindle that's been broken apart and has a special set of buttons attached to it. This was a do-it-yourself hacker whose sister couldn't manage this tiny keys on a Kindle, so he broke it open. Actually, voided the warranty, opened the back of the thing, built a custom electronics board to connect custom keys to it. Okay, that's going a little far. I mean, I don't expect everybody to be an electrical engineer, but it's a nice metaphor for the sort of hoops we have to jump through to connect things when they're added on. You have to remember to bring it. You have to be able to connect it. It has to connect right. The hardware has to interact. The software has to interact. And we've added lots more opportunities for failure between the user and their interaction. The next principle is helpful wayfinding. So we can think about guiding users. And the goal here is that people can navigate around a site, around a feature, or around a page following self-explanatory guidepost. Steve L., you're exactly right. They're using the easy access keypad from Trace on the Amtrak kiosks. I bet a lot of us have used some sort of map feature where you can get directions and it will give you either a display or a printout of how to get from one place to another. This screen happens to be a version of Google Maps. What I didn't know until I started plowing around the web looking for it was that the original design for Google Maps was entirely visual. The idea was that it would just be an electronic version of taking a paper map and putting highlighters on it. And again, T.V. Rahman started experimenting with what has become the text instructions. Now, I can't imagine trying to use Google Maps without the text instructions, especially if I'm printing it out to take with me and I'm driving. But here's an example of wayfinding in the physical world actually projected into wayfinding in the digital world. And I want to talk a little bit about one of the ways you might navigate around a page using digital signposting. So we have on the screen a picture of a very simple website. It's a website or a blog with a banner at the top, a main part in the middle of the screen. It's got some auxiliary information on the right side, and it's got a footer with some more navigation at the bottom. In HTML5, we can identify those elements of the screen. The whole thing is an article. We can identify asides, footers, headers, navigation elements, sections, and main. We can do the same thing with ARIA. ARIA is another W3C standard. It stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. And there's been a lot of very hard work done to line these up so they match up. So if I have, in HTML5 they're called elements, in ARIA they're called roles. So if I have marked the HTML5 element of main with an ARIA role of main, and if I'm navigating using ARIA roles, and I come to this page and all I want to do is read the article, I can jump over the navigation and the banner and the links and get right to the content. Similarly, if I'm looking for the footer navigation because I've learned to expect that it will be there, I can jump down to footer or to complementary. And so you can jump down to the specific type of information you're looking for, making it easier to find your way around the screen. It provides a map in code that reflects the visual map, but more importantly, it reflects the logical organization of the information on the screen. And so if we think about it, this comes all the way back to clear purpose, because if you haven't thought clearly about your purpose, then your screen design probably isn't clear, and it's a little hard to code. It's hard to explain, and therefore it's also hard for people to navigate. I had an occasion to work with a project that was using an online innovation platform. It was a very complicated screen, had lots of pieces and parts to it, and we suddenly realized that it was going to be very difficult to navigate. There were some actual accessibility barriers we were fixing, like forms that didn't work right, but we also were worried about navigation, and we did not have time to rebuild the entire site. So we did something that's kind of a workaround, but it was also the first stage of work of rebuilding the site, which is we thought about what the parts of the screen were. We had at the top, there's a title. There's a little timeline bar that shows the phases of the work. There's an activity board section that shows all of the chatter feed. There's the main content. There's statistics about the site, about the idea, and so on. And we put a set of what are called skip links at the top. Now, this is definitely a bit of a Band-Aid, but the point is that that Band-Aid made it possible for people to work, and it did the design work that we hope will end up with the site being rebuilt in proper standards-based code. It took about 7 links to get people around the page, and what was interesting is that in the title of the link, in the text of the link, we were actually able to explain the meaning of the sections in a way that people found quite helpful. So just because you've got an old site that's been built in older technology, don't despair that you can't do this. You certainly can. We'll talk about getting down into the content in a minute, because at all levels we need to provide ways to help people orient and navigate. The next principle is presentation, and of course this is about presentation that supports meaning. Right? Obviously we worry about the aesthetics and the emotional impact of the design, but I'm thinking about how the presentation and how the visual design actually helps people perceive and understand elements in the page. The picture on the screen is simply here because it's an example of visual hierarchy. It's the front and back of the Target pharmacy labels, which were redesigned in an academic project and which Target adopted. One of the things about medicine bottle labeling is that the most important stuff wasn't always the biggest. So when she redesigned it, the name of the drug is the biggest thing. Your name is visible. How do you take it? Cautions on the back are all much more important than number of refills or the name of the prescribing doctor. So she thought very carefully about that information hierarchy. Even the yellow ring at the bottom of the cap is actually personalizable, so that if you have two people in a house taking medicine, they can each have their own color. So in addition to the double check of their name on the bottle, there's a quick visual identification for those who can perceive color of the color of the ring. Right? And the point of this is that flexible presentation allows and supports user needs. There's three screen captures on here, and they're from a project called CSS N Garden that was based on some work that Molly Halschlag did with, I'm sorry, I forget the name of her partner, David. And they built a site that had a bit of HTML code, and they challenged people to come up with different CSS that would change the presentation. And there are hundreds of them out there that are just different organization. I mean, the screens are rearranged differently. There are different styles. There are different colors. There are different size fonts, all done in the CSS layer without touching the HTML. So it just shows that you can use that flexible presentation for branding, but you can also use it to accommodate needs and preferences, because if I needed large text, we could fix that in the CSS without having to go into the code. We could do it by having our own style sheet, a personal style sheet, or we could do it by having a style sheet that was flexible enough to respond to things like a request to change the text size in the browser. Next, I want to get to the question of language and the actual language we use and how websites and web apps create a conversation. The goal here is to, thank you for David Shea, who was the person who did Zen Garden. I just blanked on his name. The goal of plain language is to make sure that people can read, understand, and use the information. The picture on the screen is from a really wonderful TED Talk by Sandra Fisher Martins on YouTube. It's in Portuguese with English subtitles. And she was talking about how she discovered plain language. She was looking at some statistics about literacy rates in her native Portugal and in Sweden. And the two graphs on the screen compare the two. There's a number of people in red, in yellow, in light green, and in dark green showing various degrees of literacy, from very poor literacy to excellent literacy. And where in Portugal about half the people did not read well, only about 10% of the people, 20% of the people had that problem in Sweden. And she began to think about all the information that people simply couldn't use because they couldn't read it. The example in her talk is of someone who received a notice about a medical operation he was waiting for and didn't understand it, thought that it meant that he wasn't going to get the operation when it actually meant that he could. So just that we think that this, lest we think that this is some sort of third world problem, this is a general global problem. In the U.S., the National Assessment of Adult Literacy is a decennial project, and they estimate that in the United States, 14% read at below basic levels. That means that they have only the most simple and concrete reading skills. They can sound out words, they can read labels, they can read simple sentences, but that's about all. 29% are at what they call basic, which is that they can manage everyday tasks, filling in a few forms, maybe reading a simple newspaper, but maybe reading bus signs and things like that, but not challenging activities. The great bulk at 44% are what they call intermediate, who can do moderately challenging reading activities like consulting reference materials. And only 13% are proficient, who can interpret and draw inferences from text and compare viewpoints. That means when you add it up, that 43 to 44% of the audience, for anything we do, doesn't read very well. And when we make things that are confusing and complicated, we are slowing down people who do read well, and we are creating a barrier for people who don't. 43% is a big hunk of the country, and it's a large audience. That might be because, now this is looking simply at literacy. It doesn't look at people who have low English proficiency, that is, might read well in a different language but not so well in English or in a second language. And I just want to show you an example of what that might mean. We worked on a project that National Cancer the National Cancer Institute had released a set of questions that were researched and well researched to help people run through a self-assessment about their risk of getting colon cancer. And because this is government public information, many different people can use it and make actually websites that incorporate this. So we were able to test 2 or 3 and compare them. The first one that we tested, people went through the questions. They had no problem with the questions. And it got to the end and it said, "Your score is 63." And we said to the people who we were working with, "What does that mean?" And they said, "I have a 63." We said, "Okay, what are you going to do next if you had a 63?" And they said, "I don't know. I guess I'll ask my doctor." Because in medical figures, that's really, the only thing you do. If you don't know what to do, you ask your doctor. That's a kind of confession that I don't really understand this. That wasn't a really great outcome because the goal was to actually get people to change their behavior, to reduce their risk, not just to know what their risk was, but to be able to reduce their risk. And then we found another version, and they went through the same set of questions, and at the end it said a page. It's not a very beautiful page, but nonetheless, it said, colon cancer, compared to a typical woman your age, your risk is much below average. And then it defined what much below average means. And it showed it in a graph that showed the lowest level of risk you could reach and where your current risk was. So there was the lowest levels because some things are in your past and you can't change them. But here's the opportunity for you to improve your health. And then over on the right, it invites action. It says, watch your risk drop. You have 3 things. Here's 3 things you can do to reduce your risk. Then below that, it said, keep up the good work. Here are 3 things you are already doing that are improving your health. And when people went through this one and we asked what they were going to do, they said, well, it says right here, I'm kind of doing okay, but I could do better. Okay, and I might do one of these 2 things. I might try it out. Let's see if I can, eat fewer servings of red meat, or I can, take an aspirin or exercise a little more. And all of a sudden, because we had this combination of clearly stated language that didn't expect you to draw inferences, a reasonable, although not fantastic design, and communication in both visuals and words, all of a sudden people understood what that was about. This is about something kind of important, so we were really glad when we found that. But it might just be as simple as how to use your app. Same principles apply. I just want to show you one other example about how we might support different reading styles and perceptions. Working on a site that's used in career centers, government career centers, and they have lots of information to help people who are out of work get work. And one of them is a chart that shows the payoff for more education and training. And it was just in one big graphic. And they said, what are we going to do to make this accessible? And our answer was to keep the chart, but to add some words around it. So we started with a good title that didn't say education and training. It said, more education means more money. We had a short summary in text that summarized the key points in the data. And when you, and then we had the graph. The graph, the alternate text on the graph simply pointed to said it was a graph and mentioned that there was data below, and you went right to the data below, and the same information in the graph was presented in readable text form. I noticed a comment that says the examples are hard to read. If you download it, they're quite large on PowerPoint. You can expand it to be able to actually read the examples if you want to be able to read the full screens. So if you're coming to this page and you're basically a visual learner, the first thing you see is this big visual. If you're coming to this page as a screen reader, someone reading the screen, you hear just the text, and it goes from a title to a summary to the data. And if you're someone who wants to see both, who wants to see the sort of change in the chart, but also get down and look at the actual data, it's there in a nice tabular form that's easy to look at and easy to read. Now, of course, we also had to make sure that table was coded so people could tell what the header row was. We had to make sure that the graph had good colors so that people, even with poor color perception, could see it. You might think, red and blue, isn't red a problem? Well, red can be a problem because some 10% of the country is red-green colorblind. Others have blue-yellow and various other forms of color blindness. So we chose a red that actually converts to a middle gray, if you look at it in grayscale. And we chose a blue that's dark enough to look black. So even in grayscale, there's good contrast between the two sets of lines. The next section is about accessible media and supporting all senses. This is so that people can use information contained in media such as images, audio, video, animation, and indeed presentations by making sure that we accommodate all different senses. This is the moment when we just have to say, yes, sometimes you do have to do more work. It's not just about doing the same work you're going to do and doing it better, but you have to take the time to do the captions, to put in the alt text and do it meaningfully. The pictures on the screen are a variety of stop signs from different countries. And the Department of Transportations and the international standards groups that do these things are sort of aware of this, and so signs have multiple cues. In this case, they have a shape, an octagon, they have a color, red, and they have words on it, stop. So even if you couldn't read the words on the screen, you might know as a driver that the red octagon with white words on it means stop, and you'd be able to obey, at least in some way, that sign. We also have to think about the alternative text simile that we put on graphics. So the picture on the screen is a fox of some kind standing on some rocks. The question of what an appropriate alternative for that information is depends on how you are using the picture. Right? It is a journalistic or content strategy question. If you're just trying to show any old fox, you might just say the alt text might be as simple as just saying photo of fox or fox. But maybe you want to show that it's a red fox and not a gray fox, in which case you need to say a few more words, red fox. Maybe the point is that this fox was photographed in a particular national wildlife park, and maybe it's a rare fox and it's a rare sighting of that, and you want to say it was a fox photographed at a particular park. Maybe the point of this article where this image is included is about the fox itself, and it might say a fox standing on rocks looks back over his shoulder at the camera. So what you describe in an image depends on how you're using the image. It's not just mechanical, right? Of course, if there are words in the image, we would want to repeat those words in text. If there are a lot of words in the image, we'd want to briefly repeat the words and then point to a longer description where someone could read it. Or we'd want to make sure that the key points in the image, even if there's words in it, are repeated in the base text. So some combination of ways of communicating the information that has caused us to put that image on the screen is what we're after. When we think about video or anything that's animated, we want to think about synchronized audio plus text. The screen is a picture of Graham Pullen, who's the author of Design Meets Disability, a wonderful book if anyone was interested in it, who was doing a talk that was recorded for the web. And there are three windows. There's a video of him talking, a video of him. There is the pictures of his slides, and there's a transcript that synchronizes to the whole thing. So you can actually click on the words in the transcript, jump to that point in the presentation, or you can move the slider bar at the bottom and jump to that point in the presentation. You can move around and resize the windows so the ones you are most interested in are visual. Could have also just done a plain old video with closed captions on them, but the point is that there are three things going on for the people live in that room, right? Graham talking, the slides the visuals that he's looking at, and the words he's saying. And we want those three things to be communicated clearly. They can be next to each other. That is, we could have non-synchronized audio and text. We could have a transcript and the video. And that's good, but the next step is to go up a level and actually synchronize them. And so moving on to the last section, which is universal usability, the goal here is not just to remove barriers, not just to not create barriers, but actually go a step further and create delight so that people can focus on the thing they're there to do, the experience of their own goals, because the product anticipates their needs. The image I've chosen to illustrate this is a screenshot from the process of signing up for Simple, which is a banking service. And I chose a service because we have more and more of these, and they cross time and they cross devices. In this case, you go onto the web, you sign up for the service, you create an account, and about a week later, a package arrives in the mail with your credit card in it and some information. You go back to the web, you download the app, you connect the number. It's a lot of steps. It's actually a lot of steps. And they have done it beautifully. One of the things they did is the entire process is laid out, but some of the text is grayed out. Things that you've finished have a checkbox next to them that shows that you've finished them, but actions that they're not ready for you to take are disabled, so you can't jump ahead of themselves and get yourself in trouble. They do things like if you have to type in a number, they show it to you superimposed over the artifact you have to look at. So if you have to read a number off the card, they show you where to find it. And they made a process that I thought was going to be incredibly difficult into one that was smooth and maybe even delightful. Now, let's get back to Mary's question, which is, how do we make all this happen? And that's really the 10th principle, which is that in practice, it has to be an integrated process, that people and organizations consider accessibility an integral part of their work and products. There are two pictures on the screen. One is of a man in a wheelchair in the middle of a street holding a sign that says, "Cut the crap and cut the curbs." Curb cuts are now a pretty universal part of urban life. When you step off a curb, there's almost always a little ramp so that your wheelchair or your stroller or your bicycle or your luggage just can wheel down into the street next to you. But most of us don't know that it took protests to get people to think this was a good idea. People actually chained their wheelchairs to manhole covers in the middle of the street. And I like this to remind us that change is hard, that we are changing attitudes and we are changing processes. And we have to think about the pace layers and how we keep them together, because maybe processes are a little easier to change than attitudes, understanding that people with disabilities are part of our audience. In fact, not just people with disabilities, that our audience includes a wide and diverse range of capabilities, and that we need to design for that is the first thing, changing that attitude. Once we've changed that attitude, changing the work product, the work process doesn't become that hard. The other picture is a shot from the control room of a place where a paper prototype test was going on, and there are two things sort of hidden in this picture. One is that it was a ballot design that the University of Baltimore and Dana Chisnell were working on, and the people they chose, they were working on clear language and clearly communicating what you do on the ballot. And so they chose to work with people who had low literacy. So the first thing that we as UXers might want to think about is how do we make sure that people with a broader range of capabilities are included in our work process. And the other thing they did was they thought about how to change that testing. They wanted something that was very fluid, and they wanted something that was not yet technology, because they were working with people who weren't big technology adopters, and they didn't want it to feel uncomfortable or that they didn't know how to do it. So their first round of testing was actually done with paper prototypes, where they sort of had a little clipboard and they would put a picture of a screen on the thing and let people talk and interact with that and talk about what they would do. That was possible because the disability they were dealing with did not involve having to use electronic digital communication. But so thinking about how we vary our research process and our design process to make sure that we can include people. I like to talk about this as changing the question, right? If we think about designing for extremes and researching for extremes, sometimes we come up with something that's even better for the middle, right? These are both pictures from a project I've been working on called the Accessible Voting Technology Initiative, in which we started asking the question, how can we make voting more accessible? The first picture is a man testing a joystick. The researchers at Michigan State University discovered that the number of key presses, if you're using linear interaction to get through a ballot, is a lot of key presses. And the people who use single switches, a switch to get through a ballot, to get through the interaction, are often people who have limited use of their hands and often pain associated with the use of their hands. So when they got to 100, 200, 300, even 400 key presses to get through a ballot, they started thinking about how much work that was. And they noticed that people were using joysticks on their wheelchair, and that joysticks can be adjusted for both very light touch and also very aggressive touch. And they began working on the electrical engineering work to design a joystick that could be used to interact with a ballot. The other thing that's nice about a joystick is it's a pretty robust device. So maybe it's touch plus joystick instead of touch plus dual switch, which aren't as common. So beginning to think about other answers. The other picture is someone working with a tablet-based ballot. And here again, they were thinking about people using just two switches, no direct interaction. And they designed a ballot. This was from a center called CATIA at Georgia Tech, where you could do the entire ballot with your thumbs just by going yes, no as an answer to each question heard through an audio stream. And then they layered on top of that more direct interaction, being able to skip around the ballot. And what they ended up with is a ballot that's really quite elegant to use and that's equally good to use in a linear stream. So changing the question and designing for the extremes ended up with something that was not sort of disabled looking, that was not ugly, that didn't look dumbed down and that didn't look medical, but that's actually rather beautiful and rather elegant, and that solves a problem for many people. And now instead of having to have two ballots, we could have one ballot. Instead of having to have people who take a really, really long time and people who whip through the ballot, we can think about how to equalize the experience. I'm continuing with pictures from that project. I think the other thing we need to do is to find better ways to collaborate. One of the things that we did was ran design workshops with election officials, people with disabilities, designers of all kinds, policymakers, and so on. And I think great ideas came out of the workshop, but that's not what I want to talk to you about. The thing that I thought that was really interesting was that some of the people in the group actually were, registered lobbyists, and they said it was great to actually get out of our echo chamber and start talking to people with different perspectives, to be able to sit down and collaborate with them. And we heard the same thing from election officials who said, usually when I sit down with people, it's in a pretty confrontational sort of way, and it was great to be able to work through the problems. And we had, the rooms were big and they were messy, and we had everybody in the room. And the other thing that we did was we thought about the fact that, not even thinking about disability, but that not everybody is comfortable drawing. And certainly people who work in words and policy may not be comfortable drawing. And so we had industrial design students and graphic design students in the room working with each table and being their scribes, so that they were, the table could talk and they were doing the visualizations. And that way everybody was kind of equal. We had people to help read the walls and read the material for people who needed that. And we had everything from sign language interpreters to wheelchairs. And it was great. It was, I was afraid it wouldn't work. I was afraid it was going to be so confusing and so many things going on that it just wouldn't work. And instead it became this real spark of collaboration that was great. One more thing we could think about doing is actually opening up our recruiting. Instead of recruiting for a very narrow band of people, we might think about recruiting for a much broader audience. You may find that if you don't restrict your recruiting too much, you will get people with various disabilities just because they're part of the audience. I was doing a project for an engineering organization, and we were using social media to try to recruit engineers. And it was all remote testing. Someone screened in, and I sent him an email with the link and the time of his session. And he wrote back and said, "Will that work with my screen reader?" And I kind of gulped because I'd never thought of it. I just didn't think about that problem. We went back and forth by email a couple of times, and I said, "Look, we're both obviously sitting at our desk. Let's just try it out." It turned out it worked, and he was one of our best participants in terms of efficiency and effectiveness. He was really good at finding answers. He had good strategies that were very interesting to see, and even more interesting, he was one of the fastest people navigating because the site was built on a really good template, and he figured out that the third heading on every page was a set of on this page links, and he could then jump down to the exact paragraph with the right information he needed, often on the first try. So that for us really confirmed the power of a solid structure and a good navigation things, but it also meant that we didn't know it was perfectly accessible, but we'd seen one user from the audience recruited using the site in a perfectly natural and normal way. The other thing I think is a real problem for us is our tools are often not accessible, and I think that story begins to point it out. And I just want to give a little call out to Loop 11, who's done a lot of work to make their platform accessible, and to Knowbility.org, who's working on building a database of people with disabilities to be test participants. So, because I think we're right at time for questions, just want to say that when you think about accessibility, you can be a UX superhero. You can be the spark that creates a new perspective in your company. One of the things when we think about perspective, I just want to come all the way back to the idea about eyeglasses and what's a fashion statement and what's a medical device. Amy Mullins, who is a paraplegic, she uses two prosthetic legs. She was one of the people who pioneered the use of the legs that you see in the Olympics for running. She has some great TED Talks if you Google her. She said she wasn't going to hide her legs. Her legs are fashion. She has legs that make her taller, and she has legs that she uses for different things. And the ones on the screen are a picture of her wearing legs, and in fact an entire outfit designed for her by Alexander McQueen. The legs are wooden, and they're ornately and beautifully carved. She has a frilly lace skirt on, and her top is a leather jerkin that makes her look like an amazing Amazon. And her legs are part of that outfit, right? She changed her perspective. Instead of it being something to hide, it became something that's part of who she is. We can do that too. We can make accessibility part of what our products are. Just something that we are naturally going to do, that we are naturally going to think about people who might prefer to use audio or prefer to use keyboards or need to use a certain kind of technology, and thinking about it as we design. And it is a chance to be a superhero. So with that, I wonder, Audra, if there are any questions, or I don't see any piled up, so I wonder if anybody has any questions they haven't asked yet.
Well, yeah, actually, we do have quite a few questions here. If you just click the refresh button, you'll see them, but I'll read them out loud.
Okay.
How far is Android behind iOS in baked-in accessibility infrastructure? And that's Alberto's question.
Yeah. Alberto, I'm not that much of a technical expert. I know they're behind. I know that, but I know that they're also working to catch up fast. And I think I'm going to sort of defer that question because I don't know that I can give an authoritative answer to it.
All right. And Dom wants to know, can you recommend any application development frameworks that may all will make all of this accessibility easier?
Don't we wish? I think there are some frameworks that are getting better. Again, I'm not a programmer, so I'm not probably the right person to ask, but I know that there's a lot of work done on both some of the existing frameworks and on accessible versions of, say, jQuery. I don't think there's anything that you can't make accessible. Mike Paciello, who does a lot of work on application programs, says, we always start from the perspective that it's not whether you can make it accessible, but how to make it accessible. Even Flash, God help us, can be made accessible. But you have to think about it. You have to think about accessibility from the beginning. So if you think about something entirely visually, without any sort of tech support, then you get something that is not designed to be accessible. If you think about something that is designed for different forms of input and different forms of output, then you're more likely to get something. I'm sorry I can't rattle off a bunch of programming languages, but I see some people talking about it in the chat, and maybe some of the more technically inclined people can weigh in there.
Not a problem. We'll move on to Cesar's question. With Connect-like technologies, do you see that there will be different approaches to motion-related disability or just an improvement in the current eye tracking technologies?
So I know that people can use eye tracking as a way to control the computer, and we're seeing things in Connect like using gestures. I think that we will see a lot more of this, and I think that some of the work being done in games is a good test bed. But imagine if you could control your television not by finding some little piece of software, hardware, and finding the right button on it, but by, putting up an open hand and closing it to turn it off, or by swiping left to right, just waving your hand left to right to change channels. I think we're going to see more of that as computer vision gets better and as the technology to do that gets better. So I do think that we're going to see, again, more things moving, this time maybe from mainstream gaming into mainstream capabilities on the platforms that will expand the range of capabilities who can use things. It seems crazy to think that the ultimate way to type is with 2 fingers on a little teeny tiny keyboard. This just can't be the final word on how we do quick messages.
All right. And Alberto also wants to know, can you recommend any profiling tools that might take a URL and render a report of its relative accessibility?
Oh, there's a whole lot of tools that do this. If you go to the WAI, the Web Accessibility Initiative, they have a few that I use. There's several accessibility toolbars from various organizations. There's one I think there's one for pretty much every browser. Some work in more than one browser. WebAIM, which is a great project at the University of Utah, has a tool called Wave that will look at a web page and show you all the problems on that page, both actual violations of standards but also warnings. There's a number of commercial tools that will do that. There's some little widgets that do things like look specifically at stuff like alt text. Firefox has an accessibility toolbar built in. But all those can do, as Ryan is pointing out in the blog, in the chat, is all they can do is look at whether the code is accurate. It can't look at whether the interaction is smooth, and that's really why we had that 9th principle about usable accessibility, universal usability, is because it can't tell you if the alt text is good or if the interaction is fluid, but at least it can tell you if you've got some horrible mistakes. And there are things that it's useful for, like checking to see whether you've actually got alt text on every image, and helping you find gaps in your work. So whichever one of the tools you choose, they are a good sort of they're like spell check, they can, or grammar check. They can help you identify problems, but they don't necessarily give you the solutions except technical solutions.
All right, excellent. Let's see here. Philip wants to know, would the various CSS layouts be an alternative CSS sheet available in the different views from the browser?
So in Zen, in the CSS N Garden, it was indeed alternative CSS sheets. And there's a lot of ways to do it. There's because CSS cascades, you can have a personal style sheet, but that's not always easy to install. You can have alternatives within the style sheet that are invoked by an interaction in the interface, but those apply to your site and your site only. There's a big project going on called Raising the Floor. It's also called Cloud for All in Europe, and it's got a couple other names depending on the funding organization, that is working on the idea of personalization in the cloud. So instead of the device being personalized, it's actually your logon that's personalized. So you can say, I need a screen reader and this is the one I like, or I like enlarged text and here's the percentage I like and here's the contrast I like. And your preference file can then talk to the website and ask the website to render itself appropriately. And I think that's really a move to get away from personalization being done at a very individual basis. I think someone asked a question about consistency among keyboards. Wouldn't it be nice if you could just say, I'd like this keyboard to be laid out in the following, using XYZ layout, and it would adjust the key press coding so that that all worked. So I think we're really at a moment when we're about to change our view of how and where we provide personalization so that people can use things well. And indeed, that might be contextual. You might say, today I'm running around on my little tiny screen and I'd like to have slightly larger text and I'd like to have higher contrast because I'm out in the sun. But tomorrow I'm going to be sitting at my desk with a large screen and I want things to be displayed appropriately for that. So we can begin to get a little smarter about how that works. I think all of our work on adjusting to different device sizes is helping understand how to do it.
All right. We have a few more questions here. How much time would you like to dedicate to the rest of these? Or
I'm happy to keep going.
All right, excellent. So AJ wants to know, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us. I am Audra Montenegro with O'Reilly Media and will be your host for today's webcast. Today we have Whitney Quisenberry, and she is going to talk to you about accessibility as a design challenge. Whitney Quisenberry combines a fascination with people and an obsession to communicate clearly with her goal of bringing user research insights to designing products where people matter. She's written 3 books, Storytelling for User Experience, Crafting Stories for Better Design and Global UX, Design and Research in a Connected World to help practitioners keep users in mind throughout the creative process, and her latest book, A Web for Everyone, Designing Accessible User Experiences, is a collaboration with Sarah Horton. She's also passionate about civic design and runs the Center for Civic Design with Dana Chisnell, where they aim to improve the usability and design of ballots and everything else about elections. They work with election officials, conduct research, and publish the field guides to ensuring voter intent. Before she was seduced by a little beige computer into software, usability, and interface design, Whitney was a theatrical lighting designer on and off Broadway, learning about storytelling from some of the masters. All right, folks, as we get our webcast started, I would like to go over some housekeeping tips to get the most out of today's event. First, you'll want to open the group chat widget if you haven't already done so. This is where we will interact with each other during the event and where you will submit your questions for Whitney. We find that our audience usually has a lot of good knowledge to share, so we encourage you to chat freely during the event. However, if you have questions for Whitney, please be sure to preface them with a capital letter Q so we know that it is for her and we can make sure she sees it for Q&A. You can also open, move, and resize any of the other widgets. If you would like to tweet from the Twitter widget, you may need to give it permission to access your account. Our hashtag today is AUX, and the Twitter widget will automatically append that to your tweet so you don't have to. If you have any problems during the event, we encourage you to look at the help widget, which is very thorough. And if you continue to have problems, post in the chat room so one of our staff can help you. For choppy audio or stalled visuals, please try refreshing your window first. And remember that the best thing you can do for a good audio stream is closing any apps that could be interfering. So because people always ask, we would like you to know that we are recording today's webcast and will have an archive available usually within 48 hours. All right, and folks, at this time it is my pleasure to turn the program over to Whitney for her presentation. Hello, Whitney.
Hi. Really glad to be with you today. It's great watching how many places around the world we're all from, and for those of you in nice, sunny, warm places, please don't tell us about it. You're all sitting, half of us are sitting in the snow. So what we're going to talk about today is accessibility, but I hope I'll be able to talk about it to you in a slightly new way. When most people think about accessibility, certainly the way I was introduced to accessibility, it's a technical challenge. It's about meeting code requirements and filling out checklists and matching standards and laws depending on what country you're in. But that's not a very satisfactory way to think about how we design. What we tend to do is design first and then kind of layer accessibility on. And I'd love to get us all to think about a new way of thinking about it, which is that what we're doing is trying to bring all the awesome apps and awesome websites and wonderful goodness that we're creating and design and create them in a way that everyone can use them. So one other apology, I have a slight cold and may have to take a little cough or water break in the middle of it. I will try not to cough directly into the microphone. Also another one, if someone needs captioning, we have live cart running. Just put it in the chat window and they'll text back the URL to you. In fact, maybe we should do that now, Audra, just to make sure, since if you need cart, you may not be able to hear what I'm saying.
Yes, I'll go ahead and push it out right now.
Thanks. So just to get us started thinking about what we mean when we talk about accessibility, I've got 4 pictures on the screen which I'll describe, but I'd like you to be thinking about, as I do, which of these are just for people with disabilities. So we have a pair of eyeglasses, a keyboard with a microphone on it, some kitchen tools, and a postal card. Eyeglasses seem pretty obvious. They're about improving your eyesight so that you can function normally in the world. I certainly wear pretty heavy glasses. The thing that's interesting about eyeglasses is that even when I was young, they were pretty ugly. They were black kind of medical devices that you wore with very thick lenses. They were heavy, they were uncomfortable, and we got teased about them. Glasses have actually changed. They're now a fashion statement. They can be beautiful, they can be tied to your wardrobe, they can reflect your personality, and they're now no longer just a medical device, they're part of how we express ourselves. The text-to-speech on the keyboard, or actually speech-to-text, so you can do speech input. Much of the text-to-speech and speech-to-text research actually started out in disability research, but now it's become mainstream. The keyboard here happens to be an Android keyboard, but the same features are available on iOS and probably most of the other platforms because we've integrated that technology into everyday devices. And I'll talk a little bit later about why that's so important. The kitchen tools shown happen to be from the OXO Good Grips line. They're nice kitchen tools, but most importantly, they were designed for people who had trouble gripping or holding small objects. So they have big, squishy handles that make them actually very comfortable for everyone. And when you go to buy them in the store, they're not in a special section that says, for people with disabilities, here's something to buy. They're just in the kitchen tools section, just like everyone else. The postal cart was actually invented. It's a United States postal cart, when women wanted to be postal carriers, and there was some worry that they would not be able to carry the large packages and large backpacks of mail that postmen had to carry. And they were told they couldn't be a postman until someone figured out that if we put those big sacks of mail on wheels, that not only could women do it, but that it removed part of the strength requirement and made it possible for many, many more people to have this job. And that's part of what we're really looking for, is how can we do something in all of these cases so that features that help people and help adapt, help people with a wider range of capabilities use the product or the service or the website or the web app. How can we make that part of just how the thing works instead of something special? There is an international standard called the International Classification of Functioning from the World Health Organization. Until the late 20th century, disability was defined in medical terms. It was defined as the functioning of a part of the body. But there was a change, and disability is now defined as the outcome of an interaction between a person and the environment or the attitudinal barriers they may face. So that means that disability isn't about the person, and it's not about the thing. It's about the interaction between those two things. When I first heard this, I got really excited because, like many people, I think I thought accessibility was a good thing. That we should all do it, but I didn't know what I could do in my work as a user researcher. I didn't know how I could contribute to that. But when we define disability as the result of an interaction, well, we are interaction designers. We design user experience. We create those things. And so now all of a sudden, I can do something about it. So every time I think about a tiny little change, putting a description on an image, or just some small change that makes it more possible for more people to use what I create, that removes those barriers, then I've done my little part that day for helping make the world more accessible. Stuart Brand, author of The Clock of the Long Now and many other interesting books, came up with a concept that he called pace layering. And the concept is that things move at different paces. If you think about an oval-shaped track or a circular track, something on the outside of that track moves very quickly in comparison to something on the inside of that track, just like an orbit. And so he drew a layer that has nature in the middle, moving very slowly, changing very slowly. The next layer out in his model of pace layering is culture, then governance, then infrastructure, then commerce, and then in the outer ring, moving very, very, very fast, is fashion. And the concept that he was thinking about was that things move at different paces, when they get out of sync, if fashion starts to move too fast, it outpaces culture. If commerce moves too slowly, it can't keep up with fashion, and so on. And we can think about this same concept, but apply it to accessibility. So on the outside, we have technology, which these days is certainly moving very, very quickly. New products being introduced, new things changing all the time. The next ring might be our habits, right? Both our habits of how we use the web and our habits of how we create the web. And we can change those. Habits can change sometimes seemingly overnight when something new is adopted. This next slower layer is work process. Because that involves coordinating between people, it changes a little more slowly. And so we have to give it time to catch up, or we have to make sure that we work on making sure that it stays up, so that the way we as teams create things can keep up with the new technologies. I put attitudes next because I think attitudes are kind of like culture. They're kind of core beliefs about what we do and why we do it, and they change even more slowly. Below that, we have laws, standards, and regulations. I was on the Section 508 Refresh Committee, and we finished our work in about 2007, 2006, and we're still waiting for that standard to be updated as it goes through a slow regulatory process. So standards take longer, laws take even longer, and I've left nature alone because I don't think anything we do is really changing nature. But when we think about this, we can see why it's easy for accessibility of products to get out of sync. If we think about the pace of technology adoption, the telephone was introduced in 1876. And then we had a long kind of stable period, at least in terms of communication technologies, until about the 80s when we started getting the fax machine, the Apple I, IBM PCs, and Walkman. And then starting in the 90s, it all started getting fast. JAWS, the screen reader, was introduced in the early 90s. Macintosh, email, Google, BlackBerry, and it all starts cascading very quickly until it seems as though, month by month things change.